Okay.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Angela Chantry. Thank
you. So, Cleopatra, who was she? What was she? Well, many things to many people, and I think you will see here that this is the vision that probably every one of you in this room have of Cleopatra VII. I'm sure we're all far too young to remember Theda Bara, Claudette Colbert, or even Vivien Leigh. You might remember the name of Vivien Leigh, but we probably never saw any of these films. But let me assure you that our Cleopatra would never have been like that, and certainly wouldn't have been like that. So this is perhaps nearer. But I think the one image that you will all remember, and you've probably all seen the film, is this one. Do you remember Elizabeth Taylor? Well, she, obviously her future husband was in it as well, Richard Burton. But this is the image that we all have of Cleopatra. So I'm going to try, hopefully, this morning, and dispel that image for you, because these are all portraying Cleopatra, a sultry, dark-haired, femme fatale. And this is how history has portrayed her, starting with the Romans of her own era. This is how we all think of her today. And perhaps we couldn't be any further from the truth, because this is more likely what she looked like. She probably had red hair, pale skin. She was Greek Macedonian. She didn't have any Egyptian appearance whatsoever. So think of her as looking, and I'll talk about these pictures towards the end, but this is more probably what Cleopatra VII actually looked like. As I say, she was Greek blood, Macedonian, not having any Egyptian appearance at all. But in her visits to Rome, she would have used the classic Greek style, which was the one which really matched with what we call the Hellenistic look. And the hairstyle that you see is referred to as the melon hairstyle. And this is a sort of image that you will always see of the real Cleopatra, because she was from that background. And these are real sculptures of her. And there was also a coin, and you can see this coin here. And this was minted during her reign, obviously, and revisionist historians are now using images like this, coins like this, to say, well, she was no great beauty after all. And you look at that and you think, she's got a prominent nose, the chin is sticking forward, she's got that grim look. But this is purely a representation that she was the ruler of Egypt at this time. And although women could rule, it was still very much a man's world. So her coins were made to make her give that image of strength. All the features were exaggerated so that she was on a par with her male rivals. Now, when she was in court at Alexandria, she used what we call a mixture, an Egyptian Ptolemaic style. And this is a blend of the Greek and Egyptian features. This is characteristic of what she would have looked like in her day. And again, these are real statues identified as Cleopatra. Now, when she gave speeches to her people, the Egyptian people, her look and her hairstyle were typically pure Egyptian. And as you can see, an image of a cobra would have been used to signify the image of a crown. For state affairs, she would have dressed in traditional garments designed to make her look like popular depictions of the Egyptian goddess Isis. And Isis, you may well know, is associated with agriculture, fertility, and loyalty, all obviously qualities that you wanted people to believe that you had. So she was Egypt's living goddess. It seems hard to get your head around it now, but she was seen as a goddess in reality, a living goddess, not just their queen, not just an ordinary person, but as the god of the Egyptian people, and she portrayed the goddess Isis. Now, as I've said, there's been a lot of spin, and this has come from various sources. Now, in Roman texts of the period, they would have called her a deluded and drunken whore. The Greeks and Middle Eastern peoples, she was a beneficent and glorious liberator. To the Egyptians, as I said, she was not just their monarch, their living goddess. And they would have seen her as Alexander the Great's true successor. But you'll find in Roman texts of this period there is very little to suggest that she restored Egypt to its former glory by recreating a great empire at Rome's expense. And her astonishing achievements have, of course, been ignored in Rome's official version of events, with most of the documentary evidence has been deliberately destroyed following her death, texts have been suppressed, and her name erased from the records. But you have to understand the two societies were quite different. Rome and all was very much a masculine place. Only men would have been in the Senate or the Forum. Women's place was in the home. They were seen as ladies, regarded as in charge of the household, but they didn't have the same rights and liberties as their Egyptian counterparts in Egypt. So there's an ideology change there as well. So you can understand why the Romans thought that she was just using her feminine wiles to beguile both Caesar and Mark Antony, which I'll come on to. But during her lifetime, she was many things to many different people. A very ambitious leader, a brilliant politician, an erudite scholar. She was a mother of four. All those first three qualities, put them in a man, no matter what he did, he would be great. But, I'm not getting my soapbox here for the feminism, but she was a mother of four, and of course she was female. So she has to use wiles and beguiles, is the way that the story goes. But she was indeed a very erudite scholar and a brilliant politician. Now, I'm sure you've all maybe seen the Rosetta Stone. It's from this that we have discovered a lot about Egypt, because it was rediscovered in 1799 by soldiers in Napoleon's army, and it was a valuable key to deciphering hieroglyphics. And the British troops defeated the French in Egypt in 1801, and this original stone came into British possession, and it's been on display at the British Museum since 1802, and arguably, and it is claimed still to be, the most visited object in the British Museum. So what does it tell us? Well, you can see from this that it's only a fraction of what the original stone would have looked like. But it's in three different, you might say, tongues or languages. You can see there, it's all about a decree, and the decree is inscribed 3 times. First in hieroglyphics, which was how the priests would have written a decree. Then in Demotic, the native Egyptian script, and also it was written in the ancient Greek, which was the language of the administration of this time. The rulers of Egypt, as I said, came from Greco-Macedonia, so this is the language they would have written in. So because it was in these 3 different scripts, it's enabled historians and language experts to not just look at this and decipher what this says, but also other ancient documents and scrolls and scripts from this period. So it's a wonderful thing to have rediscovered. So we're talking about Alexander the Great. I'm obviously starting with his death. He died obviously early, but at the time of his death, this was his empire. All this green area that you can see was the empire that he conquered. And you can see that Egypt is within that empire. So what happens after he dies? Well, and this is how everyone would have viewed it, the Hellenistic world, and the word comes from Hellas, Greek, it's the word for Greece. And so from 323, the time of his death, until the annexation of Greece by Rome in 146 BC, this is what the Hellenistic world people would have been referring to. But gradually, of course, the Romans eat it away, piecemeal by piecemeal, as you'll see. So after he died, Alexander, his empire was divided between 4 rulers: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and the one that we're interested here is Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy was Alexander's very trusted advisor. He was a Macedonian general, and many historians actually believe that he was Alexander's half-brother, and they shared the same father. So this is why people claim, with some authority, that you go down the line from Ptolemy down to Cleopatra, and if he was indeed kin to Alexander, she is indeed the true heiress of a descendant of Alexander the Great. So Ptolemy ruled Egypt, and he established the dynasty. He spoke Greek, as did all of his descendants, but Cleopatra was the only one who ever learnt the Egyptian language. And that's important to remember this. In 305, he demanded the title of Pharaoh of Egypt, or as some people say, the King of Egypt. So he's now the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he sets up a dynasty. I'm not expecting you to be able to read any of this. I just want to point out that here he is at the top, Ptolemy, and we go down through all of these descendants till we come to Cleopatra, who, through Caesar, she had a child, a son, and through Mark Antony, she had 3 children. And the other point I wanted to make about this, that all the sons were called Ptolemy. Even if there was 2 sons in the same family, they were still called Ptolemy. They might have had an addition to the name to separate them from a brother. But all the boys were called Ptolemy, and the girls tended to be either Berenice, Arsinoe, or indeed Cleopatra. This was the common name that was used throughout. Now, there's a very strange thing about this period in Egypt that you may not be aware of. That there were marriages between brother and sister, and sometimes even between father and daughter. Now, this may seem very strange to us in this day and age, but think about it. 2 families create a bigger family. Then those children marry again, and you end up with a very big extended family. That's the last thing you need if you're a royal dynasty. You don't want hundreds of people down the line all saying they have a claim to your throne. All you need is an heir, as we say, an heir and a spare. So this may be one reason why the Ptolemies in Egypt often married their own kin, brother, sister, father, daughter. And the other reason it is believed is because, as I say, they were set apart. They weren't just ordinary human beings. They weren't just even kings and queens. We don't think about Queen Elizabeth as somebody immortal, a god or a goddess. We just don't think of her like that. She is a person. She may have an extraordinary job, but she's still a person. But in this society, they were thought of as gods and goddesses. So it may have been another reason that they were trying to ensure that the blood was always pure. It was passed from brother to, when they had children, it was passed down, but the blood was always pure. Now, women in Egypt had, as I said, a lot of special rights that other societies didn't allow women. They could inherit and own property independent of their male relatives. They could arrange their own marriages. They were not under their husband's control. They could manage their own business affairs. They could serve as priests in local temples. And even in a court situation, they were legally equal to men. But despite all of that, I will remind you that ancient Egypt was a society dominated by men. And Ptolemy made sure that Egypt's growing capital, Alexandria, adopted the Greek way of life. It was a beautiful, wealthy city. The main streets were paved and lit at night. Many buildings were made of marble. There were sculptures and statues everywhere, and the air was filled with perfumes and spices. The nearest equivalent I can think of this is we go down the line to the 7th, 8th century, and you remember Cordoba, when it was taken over by the Moors? Cordoba was so far superior to London or any other European city. And that's how you've got to think of as Alexandria. It even surpassed Rome. Its 2 harbours, They could hold 1,200 ships at once in each. Its traders, scholars and sailors came from all over the world. They brought knowledge and goods from Greece, Italy, Asia and other regions of Africa. As I say, Alexandria even outshone Rome in terms of its population, history and culture. It had 300,000 citizens, but they were made up of different groups. The Greeks, of course, were the powerful ruling class, and they lived in the middle, nearest to the harbour. The Egyptians were considered as second class, and they lived to the west. And the Jewish quarter, as you can see, is up here to the east. So each section was segregated, and the Greeks did not in any way assimilate themselves into Egyptian life. And the Nile River was essential to life and economic success. During the rainy season, the river would flood, sending water out of the shallow valley. When these waters receded, a layer of dense, fertile soil was left behind. Farmers were able to grow all kinds of fruits and vegetables, including grapes. They made wine. They had huge quantities of wheat, and these products were used in Egypt, but also sold to other countries. But the reverse of that coin is, should there be a drought or the rainy season came late and the flooding was minimal, then of course you could have the opposite. You could have food shortages and unrest among people, and of course people tend to blame their monarchs when things go wrong. So it was a delicate balance, good years and bad years, but this was the source of ancient prosperity. Now these are Cleopatra's parents, Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra V. Historians don't really know whether she was the sister or the cousin, but she was certainly related. And between them, Cleopatra and Ptolemy had Berenice IV. And the other children, we don't know if they all came from the same mother or other mothers. We don't know. So Cleopatra was the eldest of the next group. Cleopatra, her brother Arsinoe, sister Arsinoe, Ptolemy, and then another Ptolemy. So there were 4 of them, plus the elder sister, Berenice. But it seems that poor Cleopatra V was out of favour. So after the first child, Berenice, she was exiled, sent away from court, and then he had these other children by different mothers. So you have to remember, she's out of the scene at the moment. So you've got the 5 children all being raised with Ptolemy. They were given the best education, Cleopatra and her sisters. They would have read a great deal. They would have been taught the art of public speaking, history and politics. But their father was a very weak and self-indulgent man. He was a drunkard and a music lover. And the last few generations of the Ptolemies had not been very skilled at managing Egypt. And at this time, for Cleopatra, the family's power was actually declining. If we look now in Rome, this was also the time of the first triumvirate, formed in 59 BC. We had Crassus, Caesar and Pompey all sharing the land between them. There was no formality about it. It had no political status, no formality about it, but these 3 guys were the most powerful people in the Roman Republic at this time. And they shared the empire between them, really. So this is the empire, 55 BC, first triumvirate. Pompey has this area here, this brownish area. Caesar has this area around here. Crassus has over here, and all the pink in this area are either affiliated or paying tribute to the empire. So you can see we've got a lot of potential here for political competition and crisis. So one clever thing that Caesar did, he decided to marry his daughter Julia to Pompey. So now you've got a very large part of the empire, and these 2 are now in a kindred relationship. And this was a coin produced at the time, which reads Julia Caesarea, Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife. So we've now got a bond between 2 of the 3 of the first triumvirate. And Ptolemy, as I say, he was not a good administrator. He was struggling to maintain his authority in Alexandria, so he negotiated a bribe for Rome to give official recognition of his kingship. And after paying 6,000 talents to Caesar and Pompey, a formal alliance was formed and his name was inscribed into the lists of friends and allies of the people of Rome. But that 6,000 talents was most of Egypt's annual revenue, and given a series of low Nile floods which led to bad harvests, famine and revolts, he couldn't increase the taxes anymore, so he had to borrow the money instead. As I said, the Romans started conquering Alexander's empire little by little, and they decided to attack and take over control of Cyprus. Cyprus at this time was governed by Ptolemy II's 12th brother. They also seized the treasury. So Ptolemy was in a bit of a quandary. What should he do? He didn't want to lose the relationship he'd just formed with the Roman Empire at great expense, 6,000 talents. So he ignored his brother's pleas for help, and Cyprus and its treasury went to Rome. Of course, this angered the Alexandrian and the Egyptian people very much, his own brother not receiving support, particularly when the brother, he decided that the Rome did offer him another job as a high priest, something on a different level, but still a job. But he wanted to die a king, so he took poison and committed suicide. So now we have the Alexandrians deciding, well, time for a change. So they exercised their ancient right to implement a change of monarch, and they replaced Ptolemy with his eldest child, Berenice. And she co-rules with her mother, Cleopatra, who had gone into exile. After 10 years is now brought back, and she is now known in the records as Cleopatra VI. There's a lot of confusion as to whether it was her or another Cleopatra, but most historians are saying that it was actually her mother, Cleopatra V, who was brought back, and now it's a new reign, so she's now called Cleopatra VI. Ptolemy escapes from Egypt with his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, who at this time is 11 years old. A year later, the mother, Cleopatra VI, dies. So of course now Berenice is expected to marry. She's a lone woman ruling Egypt. No problem with her ruling, but she is expected to have a man as a co-regent with her. So this guy called Philip II, he used to be a ruler of this Seleucid kingdom here, but Pompey annexed Seleucid as part of Syria, so all this now is a Roman province. So Philip II, who was once a king there, not the last king, but he was once a king there, he tries to get the help of the Roman governor, Gabinus, so that he can marry Berenice, because he sees his future. If he marries Berenice, he would then become a king again. He will be co-ruler of Egypt. But the Roman governor prevented him from doing that, and it was probably the Roman governor Gabinus who ordered Philip II to be murdered. So he's now off the scene. So Berenice continues to rule alone, but her consuls force her to marry Seleucus VII. Now he's another ex-king from that Seleucid Empire, again dethroned because of the Romans taking over. So she marries him, and she allegedly has him strangled a few days later, as one would. So again, she's ruling alone, so again she's forced to marry. So this time, she marries a priest, Archelaus. Now, although they are married, he is a priest, and he does not become her co-regent, but she does now have a man that she's married to, which rather defies the rule, you might say, of only marrying within the family. But there was likely that there was no intention that that marriage would produce offspring. It may sound complicated, but she's married a priest, but the intention will be that the children would come within the royal blood. To complicate matters even further, Gabinus, Roman governor, not only did he take bribes from Archelaus to help him marry Berenice, but at the same time he's taking bribes from Berenice's father, Ptolemy, who's gone to Rome to escape from Egypt, and he's taking bribes to help Ptolemy get his throne back. And she was only husband to Archelaus for 6 months because a battle ensues and Ptolemy retakes the throne. Archelaus died in the battle, and poor old Berenice, she has her head chopped off. So that is the end of the elder sister Berenice and her husband Archelaus of 6 months, and now we have Ptolemy back on the throne. Now the only reason I mention Mark Antony is because this is where his first appearance is in the story. He's amongst the cavalry. He's only a young man then, not the man he later becomes, but he was actually in this battle when Ptolemy regains his throne. So Julia, as I mentioned, had been married off to Pompey in 59 BC, was sadly 5 years later, 54 BC, she dies in childbirth, and the child itself only lives for a few days. So this has now severed any connection between her father, Julius Caesar, and Pompey. They had a relationship that was now severed, so we're back to the 3 people in the Roman triumvirate. So we've lost the connection, his daughter, the wife, and Crassus has an ignominious defeat and death at Carrhae, at the hands of the Parthians in 53 BC. So now the first triumvirate is obviously undermined. Instead of being 3 of them, there's only 2 of them. So now we have a contest for power between Caesar and Pompey, and obviously the lands that were previously held by Crassus. And Cleopatra became co-ruler with her father in May 52. So she is now with her father, the eldest daughter, and she is co-ruling. But this doesn't last for very long, because the father then dies a year later, and in his will he declares that Cleopatra should rule with her brother, the next brother down, Ptolemy, who would become Ptolemy the 13th. So they should rule together following his death. But Cleopatra suppressed news of her father's death to all but her inner circle. She continued to issue official documents in hers and her father's joint names, and the Senate in Rome only received official confirmation of his death 4 months later. But this had given Cleopatra some time to bring together her own group of advisors. Her father had left no money in the treasury, and with the low Nile floods that year and poor harvests, she was forced to impose a heavy taxation. So she is now ruling and married to her younger brother. She's 18 at this time, and the brother is 10, obviously underage. So a regent is appointed for him, Pothinus. And the Roman Republic, because they're still friends of the Roman Republic and a formal bond, a formal tie, the Roman Republic becomes the guardians of this relationship. It's up to them to make sure that neither one nor the other tries to supersede the other. But Ptolemy, and probably more to do with his advisor, Pothinus, they attempted to depose Cleopatra, and they forced her to leave Alexandria. You can understand that perhaps in a little way, because he sees himself as a man, although his sister is obviously older, but she is still the queen with the face on the coin. She is still minting coins just with her own image, and his name is being omitted from all the official documents. because Pothinus is only acting on his behalf. He's not a co-ruler. So you can understand perhaps why her younger brother was getting a bit miffed off and wanted to take over himself and get rid of his sister Cleopatra. So they gain control of Alexandria. Cleopatra is forced out of the city. She takes refuge in Syria, but she soon organised her own army, and of course civil war now begins in Egypt. To complicate the matters even more, she minted her own coin, as I said, but to complicate it even more, their sister also now starts to claim the throne. And she did in fact rule for a short while. So you've got all four of them, got Cleopatra with her own army, you've got her brother, Ptolemy XIII, plotting against her with his advisor, and now you've got the younger sister, Arsinoe, laying her claim to the throne. So a very complicated and difficult situation. But at this point in time, 48 BC, Pompey is defeated. So he goes to Egypt seeking refuge from the pursuing rival, Julius Caesar. And initially, Ptolemy XIII and Pothinus pretend to accept his request and say that yes, you're welcome, come to Egypt. But Pothinus instead had the general murdered in hopes of winning favour with Caesar when the victorious general arrived. Quite the contrary happened when Caesar did arrive. He was presented with Pompey's head, as you can see here, and he is quite disgusted. You can imagine, because although they were rivals, they had at once had a relationship. His daughter had been married to Pompey, and they still respected each other as generals, Roman generals. So he was totally disgusted at this underhand and cheating way of getting Pompey to come to Egypt only to murder him. So Julius Caesar now says he orders a proper burial for Pompey. He puts the body back together and he's given a proper Roman funeral. Caesar settles into the palace and he declares his intention to carry out his duty as the executor of Ptolemy XII's will to ensure that both Cleopatra is reinstalled and that she rules with her half-brother. And then he ordered both of them to appear before him. Now you may, if you've watched the film I mentioned with Elizabeth Taylor, according to this famous version of events, related, and this was actually related by the 1st century AD Greek historian Plutarch, Cleopatra didn't know how to get into the palace without being caught by her brother's spies. So she hit upon the idea of stretching herself full length in a carpet which her courtier carried into Caesar. Do you remember this bit from the film? Yeah.
It is the command of my queen that I deliver a gift personally to Caesar.
I am Caesar. Lay it here before me.
Forgive me, my lord, that I am but you are not Caesar. Are you general, if you know your commands? My queen's gift is for the eyes of Caesar. Alone.
That rat seems harmless enough.
No, Caesar.
Do you bring me your sword with you?
It was less comfortable that way.
For you or the rat?
That's all, Caesar. Right, such a delicate weed. If I may untie it for you.
Turn it over first.
But the rug is now right side up.
I understand, but I wanted the wrong side up. Should I let me down with my sword?
No, no.
Fine. I can tell more about the quality of version later. Tell me the backside first.
places. You know, upper and lower Egypt, we. Yeah.
I'm sorry about the sound, you couldn't really hear what they were saying, but I'm sure you got the gist of it. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. That's a typical portrayal for a film. Obviously that bears very, very little relationship to reality. And of course the emphasis there was on the bottom, as I'm sure you gathered, all sexual innuendo. But this is what modern films are about, so we have to go back to the reality. And it's far more likely that she was swathed in a very voluminous sheet-like mantle, because at this time, the Egyptians, they often used what was on the top of the bed, a big cover. If they got up in the morning, they would often just spread it around them, as this sort of mantle is trying to portray. And also, she lived in that palace for a long time, childhood, so she knew every nook and cranny, as obviously did her brother. But it's far more likely that she was dressed something like this, and any guards would have assumed not to challenge because it would have been a lady of the night being brought in to Caesar. That is a far more likely explanation, that she was dressed like this and no one challenged them as they came through the corridors to Caesar's room. But the point about it is, she did get an audience with Caesar before her brother. And that's an important point. And the ancient sources all agree that Cleopatra's character exerted such a force all on its own. She could converse easily on all matters of culture and politics, enhanced by travel to Greece, Italy and Syria. She was therefore someone that could talk on a par with Caesar himself. She was 22, he was 52, and you can imagine a bit of flattery would have gone a long way. So when her brother arrived the next morning and saw her seated next to Caesar, you can imagine how furious he would have been. But as the arbitrator of the will, Caesar announces that the siblings would co-rule Egypt together. And to assuage public feeling, he also brought into the succession the two remaining children. The younger Ptolemy and his sister Arsinoe, they were made joint rulers of Cyprus. Although Rome had only taken the island 10 years earlier, Caesar now gave it back to the Ptolemies, a reversal of policy which caused an outrage in Rome. Although Ptolemy XIII and his younger brother, the 14th, and their sister Arsinoe were all officially recognised as monarchs by Rome, the other three knew that the real power lay with their despised sister and her new ally Caesar, and they knew that they were partners in every sense of the word. Determined to depose Cleopatra, Ptolemy allied himself with his sister Arsinoe, and they jointly organised the factions of the army loyal to them against those loyal to Cleopatra. And bearing in mind, Caesar had only brought a relatively small part of his army with him. So a battle ensues. The siege of Alexandria. It took place mid-December inside Alexandria itself, which suffered serious damage, including the burning of part of the library of Alexandria, which had been renowned in its day for holding thousands of texts. The arrival of Roman reinforcements gave the victory to Caesar and to Cleopatra, forcing Ptolemy and Arsinoe to flee the city. Now, whether he drowned attempting to cross the Nile, fleeing, or whether he was going to seek negotiations, nobody can really be sure, but he did drown crossing the Nile. And so 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV now becomes Cleopatra's husband and nominal co-ruler, although her name once again is taking precedence. But this does not seem to have prevented Cleopatra from marrying Caesar according to Egyptian rites. Because Caesar was still married to Calpurnia back in Rome, his polygamous marriage to Cleopatra was not recognised in Roman law, as indeed was his marriage anyway, because a Roman citizen was not allowed to marry a foreigner. So this explains why Roman sources always refer to Cleopatra as Caesar's mistress rather than his wife. In Egypt, she was legally married to him, but not in Rome. She was only his mistress. Their first son, Caesarion, was born a few months later, and Cleopatra insisted that he was the son of Julius Caesar. Caesarion was said to have inherited his father's looks and manner, but Caesar apparently did not officially acknowledge him at this time. Nevertheless, he may have allowed his name to be used, because he was known as Caesarion. And just as an aside, this granite head has been attributed to Caesarion, who obviously will become Ptolemy XV. It was found in Alexandria's harbour only as late as 1992. You can imagine that on the birth of her child, there would have been spectacular Thanksgiving celebrations. And this was her first child and first heir. And that year, the Nile flood came early. So the living Isis has now brought forth the waters just in the same way that she has brought forth a child. You have to remember it's a very suspicious type of society, so the two would have been linked. The waters have come early and has her now produced a child. So to mark her country's renewed fertility, Cleopatra adopted a double form of the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, on one side of the coin, and on the other she shows herself as a mother. You probably can't see it, but there's the head of the baby. So one side the mother, and the other she's showing the horn of plenty for her country, so the mother of both. So Caesar's now gained a loyal ally, a potential heir, a steady cash flow and a reliable source of grain for his people back in Rome. And to ensure Cleopatra's safety and maintain her position, he left 3 legions in Alexandria. Their presence would also demonstrate to his critics back in Rome that he had made Egypt a Roman protectorate. It would also offset any suggestion of Rome seizing the country and simply making it a province, which he would certainly have done if he hadn't been romantically involved with its monarch. Arsinoe, the sister, was captured and taken to Rome, where she was forced to appear in Caesar's triumph. Despite the custom of strangling prominent prisoners in triumphs when the festivities were at an end, Caesar was pressured to spare Arsinoe, and he granted her sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. 20 months later, Caesar invites Cleopatra to join him in Rome with their son Caesarion. But she was wise enough to also take her co-ruler brother, Ptolemy XIV, with her to prevent any takeover bid during her absence. As invited heads of state, they were formally received by Caesar and awarded the title Friend and Ally of the Roman people, the same title her father had worked so hard to achieve 13 years earlier at that great cost of 6,000 talents. Cleopatra, as I said, she was a wily politician. Her hope would be that eventually the son, Caesarion, would succeed the father as the head of the Roman Empire, not just of Egypt. If Julius Caesar didn't have a son, that was the heir she was hoping who would become the leader of the Roman Empire. To mark his victory against Pompey, Caesar had a temple built in honour of Venus, and alongside the statue of the goddess Venus, he added a statue of Cleopatra, giving divine authority to a woman in the very centre of the city of Rome, and this was clearly political dynamite. Caesar was working on a new law to make it legal for the dictator to have more than one marriage for the purpose of producing an heir, clear evidence of the serious nature of their relationship and their intentions for the son, Caesarion. And this statue, which is believed to be a copy that was in that temple, was discovered in 1933. But as you all know, on 15th of March, Caesar was murdered in Rome by a group of conspirators. And the most notable member, of course, was Brutus. And I always thought it was A2 Brutus, but apparently some historians believe it's U2 my son, Kaisu Teknon. So, understandably, Cleopatra and her entourage leave Rome very quickly, and she was pregnant again with Caesar's child, but she had a miscarriage during that quick departure from Rome. So she now poisons her brother, her co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV. Of course, he had just reached the age of 15, so it was notional adulthood, and he obviously wanted more power for himself, and she had no intention whatsoever of giving it to him. So she has him poisoned, and she replaces him with the nephew, her own son, Caesarion, now known as Ptolemy XV. So he is proclaimed co-ruler. He's age 3 at this time. I know the picture doesn't look like that, but he was age 3, and he is now co-ruler with his mother. But obviously, co-ruler in name, she keeps all the power to herself. Oh, there you are. Now, after Caesar's assassination, Mark Antony joined forces with Lepidus, one of Caesar's generals, and Caesar's great-nephew. Octavian was Caesar's great-nephew, and they now form a 3-man second triumvirate. But unlike the first one, this one is made an official institution, and it's the overwhelming power in the Roman state because it now has full legal sanction. And Octavian, you may be aware, had been named by Julius Caesar as his adopted son. But these three, Mark Antony, Lepidus and Octavian, are now the power in Rome. And of course the first thing they do is to find the murderers of Julius Caesar. And after 2 years, they defeat Caesar's enemies and murderers. They divide the government of the Republic between themselves. Mark Antony gets this blue area here, Lepidus here, and Caracas here. So they're dividing the empire between the three of them. And this triumvirate, the second triumvirate, actually lasted for 2 5-year terms. But you now have, of course, Egypt will become within this power area here. You can see they're getting ever closer to the kingdom of Egypt. So Mark Antony, he sent an envoy to Egypt to invite Cleopatra to join him in Tarsus. He was not prepared to go to Egypt like a supplicant. He invited Cleopatra to come and meet him, but he needed her assistance in his plans for the East. So this is why he invited her to Tarsus. And equally, she recognised in Mark Antony a real possibility of forming a new alliance with Rome. She'd had it with Julius Caesar. Those hopes had been dashed, but she could now see the possibility with this new guy, Mark Antony, of forming a relationship with him and getting support for her own son, because Mark Antony had been Julius Caesar's closest supporter. So she's looking for that support now to maintain her own position and that of her son. Now, as I mentioned, Arsinoe had been given sanctuary in the Temple of Artemis, but she lived there a few years, but Cleopatra, quite naturally, still perceived her as a threat to her power. So on Cleopatra's instigation, Mark Antony orders her to be executed on the steps of the temple. And this is a gross violation of the temple sanctuary, and of course an act which scandalised Rome. So not a good start to their relationship. But I'll put this in as an aside, because there's always new information coming as historians. You can't help but want to find out a bit more all the time. And I don't know whether any of you may have seen this documentary, it's some time ago now, but it was based on the groundbreaking discovery of human remains in a tomb that was 500 miles from Egypt. It was near Ephesus, Turkey, and using state-of-the-art facial reconstruction and forensic techniques with anthropological and architectural analysis of the tomb, the experts are now convinced that this skeleton does indeed belong to the murdered sister, Arsinoe. But perhaps what is more important, they've tried to reconstruct the skull. The skull was lost during the Second World War, but after it was discovered, as I say, in 2009, they've reconstructed what they think was the skull of these bones that were discovered, and they believe that there is a possibility that if that was Arsinoe, you can see that there's some African heritage there. So what they're now trying to suggest, it's only a suggestion, a hypothesis, that maybe those 4 mothers, or different mothers, of the 4 children, one of them may have been from a mistress of African descent. And if that one was, who's to say that there wasn't some African descent in Cleopatra? But it's only a surmisal based on reconstruction of the skull that's been rediscovered all these many, many years later. But until this point, 2009, no one has ever questioned that the family lineage was always just purely Greek Caucasian. So Mark Antony now goes out of his way to please Cleopatra. If you remember, Caesar 10 years earlier had given Cyprus to her. Well, he now gives her Roman Sicilia here. She returns home, Cleopatra, and invites Mark Antony to come and join her there. After quelling a rebellion in Syria, he arrives in Alexandria at the end of 41 BC. But this was a very tense period. Like the first triumvirate, you've got the second triumvirate, very unstable. These 3 men are very conscious of what power and lands each others have. There are always jealousies and ambitions. And civil war breaks out between Antony and Octavian. So to try and bring a peace, they form a family relationship. Mark Antony, marries Octavian's sister, called Octavia. So we now have a relationship between the 2 main rulers of Rome. But despite having married Octavia, Mark Antony is clearly living openly in Alexandria with Cleopatra. They have twins in December 40 BC, and then another son 4 years later, again called Ptolemy. So Octavian, a master of propaganda, starts to work public opinion against his colleague Mark Antony. He's in Rome, he's at the Senate, he's got every opportunity to start weaving rumours and lies and stories about Mark Antony and Cleopatra's long-term ambitions with these children that they're having. An ill-judged political move by Lepidus removes him off the scene, which this then gives Octavia the excuse he needs. So we now have just a power, the power between Mark Antony and Octavian, just as we had before. So who is going to win out between these 2 and the lands that were previously held by Lepidus? And you may think this was highly, highly foolish of Mark Antony. It's easy to look back from our perspective, but you can understand how what's called the donations of Alexandria really infuriated the people back in Rome. Now this was a religious political statement by Cleopatra and Antony, in which they distribute lands held by Rome and Parthia amongst Cleopatra's children, and granted them all titles. Cyprus was added to Egypt, which was to be ruled by, there you've got the original Cleopatra's original kingdom of Egypt. Cyprus is now added permanently to Egypt, and then we have one of the twins, Alexander, is made king of Armenia. He's also made king of Media and Parthia. They haven't been conquered yet, but that's Mark Antony's next plan, that they will be conquered and they will all be under the kingship of Alexander. And the other twin, Cleopatra, is given Cyrenaica, but she's also given Libya. And this is still controlled and owned by Octavian. So you can imagine the outrage that this all caused. And then to the youngest, he is given Syria. So, and the paler screen there, these are the other territories which Mark Antony still rules himself. So you can imagine that this was just absolutely an outrage to everyone back in Rome. To add more fuel to the fire, Caesarion is proclaimed as the son of the deified Julius Caesar, so he becomes son of God, king of kings and king of Egypt, and declared the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. A direct confrontation with Octavian, because Octavian was named as the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar. But now they've proclaimed that it is the son, Caesarion, who is legally and legitimately the heir of Julius Caesar. And of course Octavian's political position is threatened by this, because if people accept this, that Caesarion is the legitimate heir, that's his power base gone straight away. And he needs much popularity and loyalty from the legions, so he needs to still be seen as the heir to Julius Caesar. So Antony formally then divorces Octavian's sister, Octavia. He sends an official notice to Rome that she and the children were to leave his house. And of course these actions are very unpopular in Rome, and the Senate swore an oath of loyalty to Octavian. And Octavian used all this Roman resentment over the donations to gain support for war against Antony and Cleopatra. In an Egyptian ceremony, Antony marries Cleopatra, and even worse, in a later ceremony, he and Cleopatra are now crowned king and queen of Egypt, and their 3 children were crowned as monarchs of the Roman Middle Eastern provinces which they'd been given under the donations. There was no other word for this than treason. So the Senate outlawed Antony, declared war on Cleopatra, and the battle occurred at sea off Actium in Greece. Octavian's general was the very shrewd Marcus Agrippa, and Antony was hampered by defections amongst his officers, and made even worse by the presence of Cleopatra on her flagship. The Roman soldiers deeply resented a woman being on the scene in a battle. So this is why there were defections, and they were not at all a happy army. Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were larger, but Agrippa easily outmaneuvered Antony. So Cleopatra was the first to flee, taking her 60 Egyptian ships with her. Antony followed in a single ship, leaving the rest of the fleet to be destroyed. Cleopatra and Antony attempted to negotiate. She was trying to protect her children and ensure the continuance of the Ptolemaic line. Now Mark Antony wrote to Rome. He said he was prepared to renounce all of his authority, return to private life in Egypt or Greece. He offered to take his own life if in that way Cleopatra might be saved. Octavian responded purely to Cleopatra only. He demanded that not only did she abdicate, but she should also have Mark Antony executed, which of course she refused. So she barricades herself. It's quite usual for monarchs of the time, pharaohs, to build their own mausoleum in anticipation of their death. That was not at all unusual. So she barricades herself in the mausoleum with her treasure. And it's very unclear as to exactly how Mark Antony died. Several versions state that he was told that Cleopatra had already killed himself, so then he either fell on his sword or he stabbed himself. Other accounts say that he committed suicide after losing the battle, but Cleopatra had Antony brought up to the mausoleum. However he died, she had the body brought to the mausoleum and allegedly had servants hoist him up to the windows because the entry gates were all barred. So he was brought up and allegedly died in her arms, but that's highly unlikely. It's more likely that he had already died, either following the battle or subsequently en route to Egypt. Cleopatra was forcibly taken from the mausoleum and put under guard. Octavian feared that she would burn her treasure and take her own life. He wanted her obviously alive and humbled so that he could walk her in chains in his triumphal procession, the object of taunts and cheers. Then 3 days before their scheduled departure to Rome, she sent Octavian a message asking to be entombed beside Mark Antony. Octavian, realising what her intent was, he immediately summoned doctors and healers and tried to go to her, but they were too late. She had already, in fact, committed suicide. Now, we know that she committed suicide by poison at the age of 39. No one quite knows how she did it. Now, Plutarch, you remember, relates that there were 2 slight pricks on her arm and that poison might have been hidden in a hollow comb that she then used to cause these pricks and to commit suicide. But it's also been held that a bite from an asp, now called the Egyptian cobra, caused her death. Many of the ancient depictions of Cleopatra with a cobra, however, were not meant to show that the cobra was her means of death. They were simply showing her reception in the afterlife, because a cobra was important to the afterlife. We also know from ancient documents that Cleopatra knew a lot about poisons. Some even suggest that she was actually testing them out on prisoners to see which was the least painful and the most quick. And we know that about 200 years after she died, Cleopatra was said to have had a quiet and pain-free death, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio. And it's also said that if she was a great beauty, she would never have taken something that could have caused such a disfiguring and painful death. She would have wanted something that made her go quietly. There's another picture here that's taken 1st century AD. This is supposed to be a replica of Cleopatra with her son behind. And this is a copper poison that she is believed to have taken. And this was portrayed only a century after her death. Now, if you read this from Christopher Schaeffer, what he is saying is that he believes that she took a cocktail of opium, hemlock and aconitum. This was a well-known poison at that time, and it was known that it caused a painless death in a few hours, where a snake bite could have been very painful and agonizing. So it's highly likely she ingested poison and was not bitten by a snake. The son, of course, Cleopatra had arranged for Caesarion to escape to India via Ethiopia. She sent a large amount of treasure with him, but Octavian offered him the crown of Egypt. So he turned back and on the advice of his tutor, but sadly, maybe Octavian had been bribed, but either way, he was assassinated and murdered back en route to Alexandria. So Octavian now becomes Egypt's new pharaoh. He's recognized by the priesthood as a living god, and this statue is placed in the temple at Karnak, showing him with all the traditional attributes of the Egyptian deity. Cleopatra and Antony's children were sent to Rome, where Octavian celebrated his great military triumph by parading the three orphans in heavy golden chains through the streets of Rome. The chains, in fact, were so heavy that the children couldn't walk properly, and this prompted great reaction and sympathy from the Romans. The children were given to Octavia, who had been Mark Antony's previous wife, but sadly Alexander and Ptolemy very soon disappeared. Under suspicious circumstances, it's clear that they were probably murdered not too long later. The daughter, Cleopatra Selene, she was married and became a queen in Africa. Juba II had been raised by Julius Caesar and later by Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian. And while growing up, Juba had actually accompanied Octavian on his military campaigns and fought alongside him in that Battle of Actium. So they became long-time friends, and when Octavian became the Emperor Augustus, he restored Juba II as the King of Numidia and arranged for him to marry Cleopatra, and he gave her a large dowry and appointed her as queen. And later they also do become queen of both Numidia and Mauritania. This is their two children, Ptolemy and Drusilla. It's believed that Cleopatra and Juba had a very happy and long-term marriage for at least 20 years. And of course these two children would have been Cleopatra's grandchildren. You can go on following their story, but it would have made this too long. But they do eventually, the son certainly gets killed off. This is the royal mausoleum of Mauritania, which holds Juba II and Cleopatra's bodies. And so, of course, now Octavian is left as the undisputed master of the Roman world. And in 27 BC, he assumes the title of Augustus Caesar, and he now reigns as the first Roman emperor until his death in 14 AD. I've been trying to find out about were they ever buried together. Some stories even say that Mark Antony was actually cremated rather than buried. But after their death, a lot about them, the imagery, the statues, everything was systematically destroyed, and everything remotely Egyptian went out of fashion. Now, many 1st century BC and AD statues have been erroneously identified as Cleopatra. I mean, you can understand why. If it's thought to have been the Cleopatra VII, then any sale value will be massively increased. But because of that destruction, we know that there are only a few statues, real statues, of her remaining. But this one has certainly been identified as her because she was the only Egyptian to use 3 cobras in her diadem instead of 1 or 2. Only Cleopatra did that. So there's been a lot of excavations and work done to try and find the burial site, and this was produced in 2019, so not very long ago. There's still investigations going on, and they found some bodies here, and they are seriously believing that this is the burial site of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. I mentioned these 2 pictures earlier, as this is more likely depictions of what Cleopatra VII really looked like. And of course, this was found in a Roman villa, but the wall was covered up immediately after Antony and Cleopatra's death, because anything, as I said, a tall Egyptian would have been destroyed. So later on, years later, that wall is taken away, and this is where we find this, what was thought to be a depiction of Cleopatra. And again, this is thought to be a posthumous portrait of her, clearly with the red hair and Greek looks. Caesar marries his daughter Julia. Oh, we've already had that. Oh no, I know what I was going to say about that. This is my final comment really on who and exactly what was Cleopatra. Now you remember that Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey, and Mark Antony marries Octavian's sister, Octavia, This is all seen as good politics. No problem. It's all part of what you do in a masculine world, trying to improve your own status, your lands and your image. So this is quite acceptable. But look at this story. Because Cleopatra first marries Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, she is written off in Roman history at least as a whore, a mistress of little import. There's no recognition of how she regained the Egyptian empire. She's actually been claimed to be one of the greatest leaders of ancient Egypt. She regained territory lost by her ancestors. She brought Egypt back to its glory. She was known to have built warehouses to store food so that it could combat the bad years of famine. She attempted to stabilise the economy by having fixed exchange rates for foreign currency. She imposed taxes and tariffs and ensured price regulation so that people couldn't make a profit during the bad years. And she was the only one who spoke the language of her Egyptian people. She spoke about 8 or 9 languages. She was very, very fluent in Greek, Latin, all of the languages of the areas that she covered. But she was the only one who could speak fluently to her own people in the language. So I ask you, was she just simply a temptress? I would say not. I would say she was indeed a survivor in a very difficult world who did have enormous achievements. So thank you for listening.